This is Land of Havilah, Matthew 10a. After Jesus had already performed many healings and cast out many demons, verse 1, he called to himself his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, and to heal every disease and every sickness. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: the first, Simon, who is called Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, John his brother, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, Lebbaeus, who was also called Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Comment. In verse 1, Jesus gave the 12 authority over unclean spirits and every disease. He's about to send them to do independent ministry, but he'll be with them in the Spirit, Matthew 28:20. We knew about Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Matthew, but that was the first mention of the others. There are 4 lists of the 12 disciples or apostles in the New Testament. Peter's always first, and Judas Iscariot last. Verse 2 calls them apostles for the first time. The basic meaning of apostle is messenger or sent one. In verse 4, it was surprising to see Simon the Canaanite on the list because a Canaanite is a non-Israelite. But it turns out to be a mistaken translation according to the NET Bible translation notes. Most modern versions render it Simon the Zealot. Zealot indicates his personality or politics, not his nationality. Verse 5. Jesus sent these 12 out and commanded them, saying, "Don't go among the Gentiles and don't enter into any city of the Samaritans. Rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, and cast out demons. Freely you received, so freely give. Don't take any gold, silver, or brass in your money belts. Take no bag for your journey, neither 2 coats, nor shoes, nor staff, for the laborer is worthy of his food. Into whatever city or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you go on. As you enter into the household, greet it. If the household is worthy, let your peace come on it, but if it isn't worthy, let your peace return to you. Whoever doesn't receive you nor hear your words as you go out of that house or that city, shake the dust off your feet. Most certainly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." Comment. In verses 5 and 6, Jesus said, "Don't go to the Gentiles or Samaritans." This is because Jesus, quote, "wasn't sent to anyone but the lost sheep of the house of Israel," Matthew 15:24. This goes back to the covenant God made with Abraham, Genesis 17:7, and Moses, Exodus 19, and Jesus' mission is to follow through on those covenants only as they relate to Israel. He has no other mission for now. In verse 2, he said, "Tell the people the kingdom of heaven is at hand." To say the kingdom of heaven is at hand was mysterious, but one thing for sure, the King of heaven was among them. In verse 8, he said, "Freely you received, so freely give." They won't be charging for healing or casting out demons. In verses 9 through 11, he said, "Take no bag, money, or extra clothing." And as implied in verse 11, they won't need to carry much food either because various people will provide it as they go. This is because Jesus' reputation is already far and wide, Matthew 3:5. Healings of every sickness draw crowds almost instantly, Matthew 8:16. Therefore, someone will be willing to provide food and lodging everywhere they go. At the Last Supper, Jesus reversed these instructions. He said the crucifixion would ruin his reputation, Luke 22:37. He would be, quote, "counted with the transgressors," end quote. Therefore, the disciples from there on out wouldn't be received like they're about to be received. They'd need to take money with them at that time and be prepared for opposition, Luke 22:35-37. In verses 12 through 15, even with the ability to heal every disease and cast out unclean spirits, they won't be received everywhere by everyone. It'll be a grave mistake for anyone to reject an apostle who's obviously manifesting the power of God. Coming up, Jesus speaks about persecution far beyond the mission trip at hand. Verse 16, "Behold, I send you out as sheep among wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils, and in their synagogues they will scourge you. Yes, and you will be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony to them and to the nations. But when they deliver you up, don't be anxious about how or what you will say, for it will be given you in that hour what you will say. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Brother will deliver up brother to death, and father his child. Children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You'll be hated by all men for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. But when they persecute you in this city, flee into the next, for most certainly I tell you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man has come. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his Lord. It is enough for the disciple that he be like his teacher, and the servant like his Lord. If they've called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more those of his household? Comment: he said he sends the disciples out as sheep among wolves. It's just a small thing to mention, but that phrase is so famous, sheep among wolves, and it comes from Jesus. It's one very small example of how Jesus influenced us. He shaped our language. And not just that, he's a top person in history, especially in the West, but even in the world as a whole, the number one influencer on our culture, history, politics, religion, ethics, and so forth. Yet he's rejected in the public square. It's virtually illegal to mention Jesus in our public school classrooms. Every morning at 7:30 a.m. we send our children out as sheep among wolves, and disciples in general live in a hostile environment. Our response in verse 16 is that we should be wise as serpents, meaning aware that we have enemies, but harmless as doves, bearing no animosity toward our enemies. In verse 17 he said, beware of men. Speaking of men, Jesus, quote, didn't entrust himself to them because he knew everyone, John 2:24. So we shouldn't fall into the trap of being too trusting. Beware of men. More to the context, if we're going to preach the gospel, there might be lethal opposition. That's the way it was for many of the 12. There was lethal opposition for them. In verses 17 through 20, putting this together with Luke 21:12 through 15, when we're brought forth on charges before governors, kings, and councils, we shouldn't prepare our statements in advance. The Holy Spirit will teach us what to say at the last minute. Quote, settle it therefore in your hearts not to meditate beforehand how to answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to withstand or to contradict. Luke 21:14 and 15. In verse 21, when the political pressure is on, even the closest of relatives will betray their own, delivering them up to death. We must remember he said it and expect it, that when he said beware of men, it included our family. In verse 22, we aren't Christians for popularity. We'll be hated when times are bad. In verse 23, quote, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes, end quote. This is an end-time prophecy, therefore we can't be too dogmatic about what it means. In verse 24, disciples not above his teacher, meaning if they'll persecute Jesus, they'll persecute his disciples. In verse 25, it's enough if a disciple is like his teacher. In other words, if we're persecuted like Jesus, that should be good enough for us. We shouldn't expect to be treated any better than he was. If they call Jesus Beelzebul, which means prince of the demons, how much more will they malign those of his household, meaning us? Matthew 10b is next at landofhavilah.net, Matthew 10b.